Hi, it's Mr. Andersen, and this is Thinking in Patterns, Level 6, Causal Patterns. Let's take a look at what's in the box. You can see there's a system that we're going to have to define. And what makes this box interesting is that we have two separate concepts that we're going to dig into. We'll always define the system, but what we're going to do is, first of all, look for all the causal relationships in the system, and then identify the patterns within those causal relationships. So we've got two objects that will represent those ideas. Remember, the green arrow always represents cause and effect, or a causal relationship, starting with the effect and then working backwards to identify what the cause is. So we'll start by identifying all the causal relationships in the system, and then we're going to just start looking for patterns. Remember, the prism represents patterns because we're looking carefully with all of our senses. So we're going to try to identify, are those causal relationships linear? Are they cyclical? By the time you're done watching this video, you should be able to identify causal relationships in something like a game of mousetrap, or in a computer model. This is an ecosystem model. But I'm going to start by showing you my thinking of causal patterns in a useless box, and then we'll work on a nursery rhyme together. So let me grab this useless box out. The useless box, you just turn on a switch, and then something happens and the switch turns off. So first of all, let me identify the system. So the system is going to be the useless box. When I turn this on, it turns itself off. We'll have to look inside it to see what's going on. You can see when I turn on this switch, a hand is coming up and it's turning it off. And we could even open it up a little bit more to get some of the details of what's going on. So I turn on this switch and then it turns off. So the first thing I should do is identify what are all the causal relationships within the useless box. And so we're going to start identifying those on the system itself first. We're looking at all the causal relationships here. So the first thing that obviously happens is I turn on a switch and then it's going to turn off. So let me show those two events. So I've got switch 1 turning on and then eventually switch 1 turning off. So I've got those two events, but we should really figure out exactly how does that work. So if I open up the useless box and we take a look at it, you can see there's some important parts in it. We've got batteries obviously, and then if I were to turn it over, you can see that there's a motor on that side. When I turn this switch, you can see that that hand goes up and turns it off. We could also play with that switch, so if I turn it off before it gets there, it goes back again. So let's start by modeling that part on the useless box. So I'm going to use these causal, the arrow to represent a cause and effect. So when I turn switch 1 on, that turns on the motor. And that causes the hand to move up, and that causes it to turn off switch 1. And so those are some things that are going on, but we'd have to dig in a little bit more to figure out what else is going on within the system. So when I was looking at this, I found that there's this switch at the top that turns it on, but there's also this switch in the back. So if I hold this one in place, you can see that the hand moves up until I let go of that switch, and then it goes back again. So if I turn it like that. All right, so let's try to identify how specifically that works with that second switch. So the two things that I see is that when the hand moves up, it turns switch 1 off, which then moves the hand back down again. We also see when the hand is moving up, it turns that second switch on, and the combination of those two make the hand move down again. Once the hand moves down, there's two other events that take place. So the last two things that take place is as the hand moves down, it turns that second switch off, which then eventually turns the motor off. And so what I've done is I've gone through the system of the useless box and I've identified all the causal relationships within this box. The next thing to do is say, what kind of patterns do we see? So what kind of a pattern do I see? Well, I could get this just looking at the phenomena. So when I turn this on, there's a clear start and there's a clear end. And so in science, we would call this a linear causal pattern. So always starting with switch 1 turning off, which eventually ends up turning switch 1 off and eventually turns off the motor. And so even though it branches here, we would call this a linear causal pattern. It's just like dominoes falling over. One thing happens, which causes another thing to happen, and it eventually ends. So let me get these out of the way, and then we'll work on a different causal pattern together. Okay, for the second one, we're going to work on this old nursery song, There's a Hole in the Bucket. That's going to be the system that we're going to try to figure out. And so the words to the song are going to be right here. I'll leave that on the screen. It starts with obviously a hole in the bucket, and then they try to fix it, which eventually leads to a problem with the bucket again. So what I'll do is pause the video. I want you to show me the causal patterns you identify. Either use a piece of paper or the thinking slides below. Pause the video, and then you can come back and I can show you my thinking. Okay, with this one, I would really try to identify what are all the events that are taking place. And so we've got a hole in the bucket, and so we've got to mend it. And so to get that, we have to cut the straw. That would be the first thing we have to do. We have to sharpen a knife to cut the straw. We have to wet the stone in order to sharpen the knife. And we have to fetch some water in a bucket. And so the first thing I would do is write out all those events. Okay, so if we start looking at it, these are all the events that I identified in the song. So what we want to do, that's the whole point of the song, is to mend the bucket. But to mend the bucket, we need to cut the straw. So we could identify that as a causal relationship. In order to mend the bucket, I need this straw. But in order to cut the straw, we need a knife. So we're going to have to sharpen the knife. We're then going to have to wet the stone so we can sharpen the knife. We then have to fetch water in a bucket, and to do that, we're going to have to use a bucket. And so you can see that this is, if we were to say like these are all the causal relationships, the pattern that starts to emerge is a pattern of cyclic causal patterns. Because to fetch the water, we have to mend the bucket, we got to cut the straw, and then it just keeps going over and over. And so a way to start thinking about causal patterns is, does it end right away? If it ends right away, then it's going to be a linear causal pattern, just like we did with the useless box. But here we're going to have more of a cyclic causal patterns. Now there's so many causal patterns out there. You might find different ones when you use the thinking slides on the game of Mousetrap or on this simulation that has wolves and sheep and grass. But that's causal patterns. I'll be sure to use the thinking slides below to do some of that, to practice on these other ones. That's causal patterns, and I hope that was helpful.